Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are today. I'm Suzanne Guillot, Director of Bucknell University Press, and I'm pleased to welcome you on behalf of the press to this discussion about the volume Teaching the 18th Century Now, Pedagogy as Ethical Engagement, co-edited by Kay Parker and Miriam L. Wallace, and published in our landmark 18th Century Studies series, Transits, Literature, Thought, and Culture, 1650 to 1850. Just a bit of business before we begin. This session is being recorded. I will be monitoring the Q&A throughout. So if you have any comments or questions while the panelists are speaking, I'd ask you to drop them into the Q&A rather than the chat. By default, only the panelists will be able to speak and to be seen on camera. Our panelists will be speaking for about 45 minutes, and then we will turn to attendee questions. We're fortunate to be joined today by Gina Zarowski, who wrote the books Coda, and will moderate today's discussion, and with Miriam Wallace. So I'll begin by introducing Miriam, and then we'll turn it over to you all. Miriam L. Wallace has been Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences and Professor of English at the University of Illinois at Springfield since 2023. She was formerly faculty at New College of Florida. Miriam is a longtime member of ASICS and the MLA, and she currently serves on the Executive Council of the MLA because we need organizations equipped to advocate for the power of the humanities and the study of literatures to respond to our current movement. She is co-PI with Dean Emily Todd on an NEH Spotlight on Humanities grant, aiming to produce model assignments that demonstrate the value of humanists for engaging generative AI in ethical and critical ways. And she is also co-editor with Mona Narain of the Transit series. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Mary.
Thank you, Suzanne. So I'm gonna pass the ball along and introduce our moderator. So I just want to say I'm delighted to see people here today and to have a chance to talk about this collection, especially at this moment in time. We're delighted to have Dr. Eugenia Zarowski moderate this discussion. You may know her as an eloquent writer and speaker on long 18th century British and colonial literatures and cultures, and a powerful voice for anti-colonial theory and practice. You may also know her as editor of the journal 18th Century Fiction and as the president of the Council of Editors of Learned Journals. But I also want to recognize her here today as a teacher, known to many of us for her account in Where Do You Know From? And exercise in placing ourselves together in the classroom, which has been borrowed and cited many times formally and in practice, in which I tried out today in my class. So without further ado, I'll pass this over to Dr. Zarowski.
Thank you so much, Miriam, and thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It is such a pleasure to be in this virtual room. I only wish it were an actual room, but I like that this is possible when that is not. The first thing I wanted to do was to invite all of the panelists who are here with us today to introduce themselves, but I just want to make sure that everybody was able to come join us in the circle of speakers. Okay, so we're waiting for Terry. While we wait for Terry to join us, I think the way that this has worked best for me in the past, because we were arranged as tiles differently in each other's screens, is I will just call randomly on speakers by first name and introduce you, or invite you to introduce yourself as I call upon you. So let's start with Travis.
Thanks, Gina. Hi, everyone. So my name is Travis Lau, he, him, his pronouns. I'm coming to you from a very gray and somewhat warmer Columbus, Ohio day. Just for a visual description for folks with limited visibility, I am a Chinese American man wearing an olive green shirt in front of really terribly misorganized bookcases. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation because I feel like this is the volume I think I needed as a graduate student to sort of think about what I was going to be doing in the profession. And a lot of my work in health humanities and disability studies informed the essay I wrote in terms of thinking about pain and its valences in the classroom. So I really appreciate this opportunity to reflect and to think alongside you. So thanks everyone for coming, especially during a very busy time of year.
Thank you, Travis. Tiffany.
Hi, I'm Tiffany Potter. I am at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver in Canada, and I am a specialist. I have an unusual job position, which is that I am a tenured full professor of literature and teaching. And so I actually spend half of my time in 18th century studies and half of my time doing the scholarship of teaching and learning related to 18th century studies. And so my project was talking about the way that we can take editing, which I know is something that is near and dear to many of our hearts, and to use the critical processes of editing in teaching in a way that delightfully, circularly reestablishes new approaches to teaching and learning for both graduate students and undergraduates.
Fantastic. Emily.
Hi, my name is Emily Casey. I use she, they pronouns. I'm Hall Assistant Professor of American Art and Culture in the Department of Art History at the University of Kansas. So I'm zooming to you today from Lawrence, Kansas, where we are currently enjoying our second false spring, which is inevitably going to be followed by more cold, but it's beautiful right now. I want to echo what Travis said. I definitely feel like this was the collection that I needed at the time that we were working on it. And so it is really a great pleasure to be able to connect with the other authors and to talk about what this work means going forward. I work on the 18th century colonial and early national North America with a focus on the early United States in a global context. I think this essay was really a catalyst for me in thinking about that relationship between my pedagogy and other aspects of my research and practice. So excited to explore that further today.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Terry.
Hi, I'm Terry Dirksen. I'm at a university that used to be Mansfield University and is now Commonwealth University Mansfield, pending whatever other changes they may make. And I'm a professor of, well, I was a professor of 18th century studies, and now I'm a professor of everything they tell me to teach, but like everything British plus all the other things. I Like everybody else, this was a collection that I really needed at the time I was writing it and then at the time it appeared. And now I think I need it again. So if we could do another round, that would be really amazing. My own research work is right now in celebrity culture and literary representation, but really honest to goodness, it's in curricular process and creating new programs and trying to survive with too few people teaching not enough students in poor circumstances with insufficient funds.
Thank you, Terry. I actually think we probably need that work now more than ever. And we've never not needed it. I think that we should all also get business cards that say professor of whatever they tell me to teach, and then some. There's so much that I want to talk with this group about, and we obviously need to rein it in to fit it within the time constraints of our session today. But I want to start with kind of one of my big questions. It's inspired by one of the things that I loved most about the idea for this collection, when Miriam first reached out to me about the possibility of writing the coda for it, I have to say, and I don't know, Miriam, if I ever told you this, but I thought there was something so brazen and courageous about titling a collection about pedagogy, like teaching something now. And it strikes me as courageous because, you know, framing something published as for now really risks, you know, the now changing between the time you imagine the thing, the time the pieces are written, the time the pieces come out, and then all of the time that the book is out in the world, right? But that made me reflect on how actually in our scholarship, maybe we have this tendency that we haven't examined very much to publish like with this hope that our work is going to be as timeless as possible once it goes out there, you know, and just hope it has some kind of longevity in the world. And to say that this is something about now calls attention to the temporal specificity and placement of all of the different moments in time that a published piece is capable of reaching. And I think that this is theoretically courageous. I think it's practically courageous. So I wanted to ask the panelists to talk a little bit about how you understood, you know, the assignment to write about your pedagogy now, maybe when you received it, when you were doing it, and like how does your now relate to your other nows when you think about your pedagogical work? I'll call on people if I have to, but I'm going to let you jump in first.
I have so much to say to that, but I can jump in on that a little bit. At the moment when I started writing, there were kind of two elements of now that were in my mind. One was that I was at a university that was in flux, and we had fewer faculty. We dropped from, I think, 13 to 8 people in English. And we also were seeing a different kind of demographic among the students. And so the now I was addressing was a moment in institutional history where we needed to reimagine what our curriculum looked like, how it was serving the students, the degree to which we had been focusing on serving ourselves rather than serving student needs and potential future needs of the institution. And at the same time, how to smuggle in the 18th century that I love so much, even while we were changing all the names of everything. And the other piece of now it was that I was reimagining my own pedagogy at that moment to try and engage at a cultural level as well as at a literary level with my students. Mine was the chocolate project piece. And so I spent many, many hours trying to figure out ways to get the students standing up and doing things and tasting things and feeling things. That piece is still very, you know, accurate to the historical moment, even more now. I think the students need to be like full sensory engaged. But Lordy, since I started writing this, we had to toss that entire curriculum and all curricula at the entire university, all majors, minors, courses, programs, and certificates had to be put in the trash. And we had 18 months to create a new general education program and all new majors, minors, and courses for a new 3-university entity. So it's been a special historical moment here at Commonwealth, where none of the things we had planned work anymore. But I'll tell you what we sort of planned out that was in the essay that I wrote ended up being the sort of scrappy Mansfield plan for futurity that we ended up adopting across a lot of disciplines, because it was nimble and thought about student-centered teaching rather than faculty-centered teaching.
Me.
I'm gonna, my thinking about now comes with a picture. And that's because I actually talked about this project at a couple of other different events. And I want to show you my picture, mostly because I was really pleased with finding a Venn diagram that I could have 4 parts of. But you can see that the sort of circularity here, because for me now is the past and the future all at the same time. And so we started with the article. The article is my nice yellow circle. Which was sort of my theory, you know, thinking about what can be, which then led to the actual teaching of a course applying the theory, which was last year, which has now led to the creation of an edition with Broadview Press, where those 7 graduate students are listed CV worthily as assistant editors, which then will work next to create a teaching guide, which then will hopefully let us do assessment of the project, which will allow us to come back to the question of teaching through editing. So, and all of this about a text written in 1824 about 1624 with the Plymouth Colony, and being published in 2024. So this 200-year arc of the past, the present, and the future. So for me, that's what now meant.
Emily and Travis, I don't know if either of you want to jump in. Emily, go ahead.
Yeah. I think following on some of the things that Terry was saying, one thread I think for many of these essays is the ways in which our teaching is informed by the conditions and constraints of the institution. And that was particularly visible and to us during periods of, for example, uh, emergency remote teaching during lockdown, or experiencing these incredible um, sort of reductions of the institution from austerity measures, budget changes. Um, I think there were many nows for me in working on this essay from the time I proposed it, when I was, you know, looking to go into my 4th year of this job that I was feeling pretty good about, and really feeling like I was beginning to get settled and get my feet under me. And that perspective really changed when I actually ended up writing the essay about teaching I was doing at an institution that had just eliminated my program and my position. It was in that, at that level, it was sort of this kind of grief writing about a thing that had been. And then by the time I was editing my piece for this volume, I was doing that as a very, very new arrival to Kansas, a place I had never even thought about, let alone lived in before, as I was preparing for a new job. And now at this juncture, I'm in my 3rd year at this job, and I have a really different sense um, of what I was writing about and how I would approach that. And so for me, I narrate that story just to say a lot of it is about the 18th century past, but it is informed by the conditions of the institutions in which we're working. And I think so much I felt of our pedagogy was informed by what was possible, but also by what we felt compelled to do, either in resistance or reaction to some of those realities. And and so I think for me, one of the reasons this was a turning point is that question of now is about always being responsive and trying to be transparent with students about the conditions of our learning, and how they shape what we talk about, what we can do. And that also means that the work is increasingly place-based, because it is about where we are now, that we're not, learning these things in an abstract college bubble, but that we're on physical campuses, or we're in relation to a physical campus, even if we're not there, if we're studying virtually. And what do the conditions of that place, how do they matter? And so I think it's interesting that that now to me is both this oscillation in time that we've been talking about between the past and the present, but it's also really about a kind of place or geography that overlaps with time that has really been enormously influential in how I think about how I do my work, but that inevitably means that it's about sort of what my students are doing and what they're learning as well.
I guess that's my cue. For me, the essay was very much in the now I was dealing with was the now of embodiment. I was just about to go on junior leave after my third year review and feeling not only sort of depleted in a way I didn't quite realize, but also my own body mind was changing significantly such that forms of pain had not only intensified but taken new forms. So for me, writing about pain at that moment was an attempt to figure out what the hell was happening to me. But as I realized as a teacher, also what was happening to my students post pandemic. And I don't even like using post because we're not post anything. So for me, the now was also a really, really important reminder that the language of pastness is often being used to ignore pandemic conditions, right? Like, oh, we are post-pandemic, the pandemic is over. So for me, it was important in that essay to really think about how those pains that are seen as part of the return to normal are in fact still very much alive in both faculty and students. And how, for me, teaching at a predominantly white institution, what does it mean to teach painful topics to students for whom such pain is not familiar? Especially as I am often teaching some of the more visceral representations of, say, things like the transatlantic slave trade, and accounts that involve the brutality of Black bodies. I mean, I feel like there's a certain kind of ethical dilemma that feels now even more charged as we sort of navigate conversations that sometimes to me get really reductive regarding things like content warnings and sort of what we should be doing in the classroom. So it's really a series of nows that are sort of linked through what it means to do care work in the classroom and to sort of hold in our minds the fact that we are coexisting as bodies in pain among other bodies in pain. We're all hurting in a lot of ways. So that essay was my attempt to not have any definitive answer about how to do that, but to sort of reflect on those challenges.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that I want to continue this conversation about the now or the many nows, but put it directly in relation to the 18th century. Whatever that means to us, I'm actually particularly interested to hear from each of you what you think the 18th century means to your students. And I'll just give you a little bit more to play with there. I don't necessarily mean when you say to a student, we're going to study the 18th century, or this is a book from the 18th century, how do they understand that? How do they interpret that? Although maybe that's also something, interesting to talk about. But I think I kind of mean, particularly in these contexts that many of us, including myself, now find ourselves in, where we were hired as researchers and teachers of the 18th century. And now there are no more designated courses in the 18th century, at least not reliably. And instead, we're being asked to teach all these different kinds of things or courses called different things in different kinds of curricula. Do you still feel a responsibility to teach the 18th century in some way? And how do you bring that to your students? Do you say, this is why it's important to know this period of time that we call this? Or do you have do you form the 18th century differently in your pedagogical kind of organization, delivery, and communication with students? So what does the 18th century mean to you and your students?
Yeah, I'll hop in if I may to start this. So I've actually kind of been thinking about this a lot recently, in relation to my scholarship. So I'm going to start there and go to the classroom. Um, I work on early national United States, and in my field of art history, but I think kind of more broadly, I feel like in our present times there has been a slew of material that has really been talking about the presence of American empire and global colonialism in the 19th century. As if, oh, this does have a precursor, but it is after 1850. And I'm quietly working away on my book manuscript, which I aspire in the near future to send to an editor and, have published, where it's all about the roots of American empire and colonialism in the 18th century. And so I have been seeing this kind of turn to a historicity that is not long enough, that has really shown me what is to me important about the 18th century, which is to say there are very long roots to things that we're still thinking about and concerned with today, but that we often ignore them, and that they have different kinds of lessons to tell us. So I'm interested in this imperial imagination of the 18th century for the early United States, because it's a time when the United States had so little power in a global sphere. And I think that has a very different takeaway about what it means to imagine empire, build empire, than it does at a moment when the United States is actually annexing territories around the world and has a lot more influence on a global stage. I think that supports a narrative of kind of inevitable US supremacism, which I think the 18th century kind of undercuts. So anyway, I've been thinking about that a lot, and I do think that's kind of what I'm trying to convey to my students, is that in, American art or history, if they think about the 18th century, they are thinking about like a row of guys in white wigs, and oftentimes I think they're expecting me to sort of be doing a kind of hagiography of those guys, like through portraiture. And I always get these like backhanded compliments early in the semester that, oh, like, you're like critical of American history. Like, I didn't expect that to happen here. And so I think the ways in which, to me, because the 18th century is close but unfamiliar, it has the capacity to surprise and upend existing narratives of how our our modern world functions. That to me is kind of the perennial value of it. And that also, what we all know, if you dig into these histories, for me, it's material cultural histories. There are so many objects and stories that create a more vibrant vision of a world than simply a kind of reductionist narrative um, of kind of like suppression of cultural diversity through colonialism. So to me, there's something very enlivening about that too, that creates the capacity for more possibilities in what we think and know about the past and how that informs us. And yeah, that closeness but far away, which I guess is the now part of your question, is what I think drew me to the 18th century, and is what I still try and center for my students. And the last thing I will say is, I do think this, I was not hired into an 18th century job. I was hired into an American art job, whatever I make that mean. But I do think, I'm proposing to teach a class that is just on the period of the revolution and early nation. So sort of, last 25 years of the 18th century. And I have struggled to figure out how to make that not sound retrograde to people. I don't think it is. There's so much really stimulating scholarship. But I think just presenting it as a course that only focuses on this 18th century moment, does people have preconceptions about it? And so thinking about how to sell it to colleagues and students to kind of show what I'm after in doing that is something I've also been thinking about.
I feel like right now, at least in the university that I'm at, I'm poised between two different kinds of challenges to teaching the 18th century. One is the charming atemporality of my students who have absolutely no clue. Like everything old is either Victorian or Shakespeare, and they have only this sort of vaguest sense that those people didn't know each other. And have no idea that there was a time between those two that where an 18th century could be positioned. And the equal ahistoricity of the curriculum that we've developed, where instead of, let's say, an 18th century class or a Regency class or a 19th century class or whatever, I teach British literature and culture, and I can do anything I want to with it. But the students have no idea what to expect from looking at the catalog, and they have no idea what they're going to get. And I am stunned after the entire class that they frequently still have no idea what they have gotten, even though we have put dates everywhere and have tried to demarcate things. And so between those two, you know, between that Scylla and that Charybdis, I feel like I'm smuggling the 18th century in, like, I don't know, a Regency brandy smuggler coming in on the coast of England from France, trying to, you know, bring brandy barrels in. It will be accepted and loved if I can only get it up to the houses, but getting it there is the challenge. So yes, I do demarcate it. Yes, I do try to label it and mark it, not because I think that these categories that we've established of 18th century or long 18th century or whatever are, you know, should be writ in letters of gold on everybody's hearts forever, but because I think that that ahistoricity that they come embodied with, creates a challenge for them in understanding connection between ideas and progression of ideas across time. And I think it's exactly what Emily was talking about. These deep roots of the things that matter to us today often are you know, find their origin in the 18th century. And for them to understand that progression of idea and sensibility, they need to understand the soil in which it grew, and they need to understand that there's a difference between the soil and the flower, right? They need to understand that the plant continues, but that that origin story is really, really important in the way that we think. So yes, I spend a lot of my time labeling. I spend time on my syllabus labeling portions so that they have to keep looking at it. I put dates next to assignments so that they know where they are. I try to, like, bundle, I color code things so that all the 18th century things are, I don't know, red this semester. And when we progress into the Regency, we move into purple and then into blue when we hit Victorian, so that they have to look at progression and try and visualize it and imagine it. But I welcome any ideas anybody else has for bringing that historicity into the conversation for students who are not really able to do that independently right now, I think, in the way that they're taught.
Tiffany?
Say very briefly that this conversation just makes me grateful. That I teach in a department where we still have, you know, 3 courses a year on 18th century studies, in which, like Terry, I have to sort of explain why the 18th century is 160 years long, but and do some of that similar kinds of grounding. I love color coding. I think it's brilliant. But I will say that I think that one of the ways that when I'm coming into this from a department that has a really good, solid 18th century studies is centered in my department. You know, we have a good, solid 18th century cohort. But for me, one of the ways that I work around it is by having an argument-based pedagogy rather than a sort of coverage model pedagogy. And so we can pick a question that the course will wrap around, either in a broad course or in a narrower course, and to have that sort of that particular subtle scholarly approach to course design, and the way that I think about text is a way to make sure they understand how the pieces of the 18th century are fitting together, and that 160 years is kind of like, 1880 to now. There's big change. And so Terry's idea of that color coding, of that sort of using some kind of visual structural marker, I think is really useful, whether you're doing argument or chronological pedagogy. And I'm very happy to get to do both right now.
I'll add something really brief. I don't want to replicate the insights of my colleagues here who have really said exactly what I would have said, which is trying to trace continuities. I mean, I think the two ways I respond to this question is one, Gina knows this well. I'm not particularly subtle about the fact that I teach in a very presentist way. I have been deeply informed by the V21 collective's real call for strategic presentism as a way for us to develop a new relationship to the past that isn't just sort of past for past sake, but really thinking about the way it animates our present. And I think for me, along with how my colleagues in this panel have described it, about really reminding students that what they talk about in terms of these conceptual categories like the human actually has an 18th century origin, I have also been trying to really frame the study of the 18th century as what we've joked about numerous times at ASEX, where it's really sort of 18th century to the present, where what is seemingly past is always sort of echoing in the present. And I think at Kenyon, it's really strange. For me, in my experience, I was hired into a position that replaced two senior 18th centuryists. So it's a very strange position to be in, the very familiar one in which at small liberal arts colleges, there's always one person for everything, and sometimes one person for two things. But it has created a really unusual pressure for me where I have to be an 18th centuryist or the 18th century does not get represented, even though my work has always in some ways been, I guess, irresponsible with period designations, because I find them in some ways the very issue that we need to interrogate. The sort of last way I've been also doing this pedagogically has been signaling to my students in very self-conscious ways how I'm trying to work against the pedagogy of the past. So I tell my students, literally not too long ago, this 18th century course would probably be taught by white dudes, focusing only on white dudes and never talking about issues of empire. And I often tell them about how I don't feel seen often, especially in my own experience as a student. I have often not felt seen in my study of the 18th century. The fact that my students often dread the 1700 to 1900 requirement is because they don't feel seen in that material. And I tell them very sort of in a self-conscious way that like my attempt to mend this is in a series of pedagogical choices. So I go for this sort of radical transparency with what choices I make in my syllabus, and I try to remind them that every syllabus is a series of choices and that there are multiple 18th centuries rather than a singular one, which is often how they're taught.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I love the idea, Travis, of a strategic irresponsibility in how we approach our teaching of the 18th century, which I think does actually capture what I love about our field, is that so many people are on board with that. If there's time during the later discussion, I have one very pragmatic tip about how to like recruit new students into 18th century studies. I tried to sell this to the romanticists and nobody bought it from me. And so I'm going to offer it to my real brethren. The 18th century is for free if there's time. But I do have one other big question that I want to pose to the panel. And no pressure, but Miriam and Mona, like I'm including you in this question if you feel called to respond. I would love to hear what you have to say. It's the question, Tiffany, that you raised, which is the relationship between pedagogy and publishing. And just to lead into this question a little bit, from my perspective, I've been a journal editor for a very long time, and for the last 10 years or so, I've also been quite active in, the kind of like the boards of societies devoted to journal editing. So this is a practice and a field of activity that is very near and dear to my heart. And like many of you have said about, you know, your research and your teaching, I know this is just the way it is for those of us who do this. You know, these are not actually separate fields of activity for us. They're all interwoven. And what I'm finding now, in this now, where at a really kind of alarming and accelerated pace, we are seeing in real time the dismantling of institutional structures of support that used to make the teaching and the research possible, right? And the teaching in particular, you know, that like brought in a certain kind of cohort of students, like allowed certain kinds of curricula to be developed, allowed for certain kinds of classroom, you know, experiments to be tried out and honed over time. As the institutional care for pedagogical space and pedagogical relations and pedagogical practice is under this kind of like corrosive attack, I'm finding that publishing and the people who are responsible for publishing of various kinds, not just journals, but also books, book series, even informal publishing like zines, right? But I see us taking up a lot of the responsibilities that can't be met in these places where I think we used to try to meet them and we were better able to meet them in our courses, in our classrooms, you know, in our research activities, in our presentations. So I'd love to hear how each of you kind of relates to publishing and editing practices and how that fits in with these kinds of pedagogical responsibilities and mandates, and not just responsibilities and mandates, but also the joy of it, right? Like the pleasure principle of the work, which I think it's more important than ever for us to continue to own that and to be able to identify it for ourselves, because the joy is part of what's being taken away from us and our students with these kinds of institutional assaults on the stuff of our scholarship.
This is really my bailiwick. As I say, I am a full professor with this secondary specialization in the scholarship of teaching and learning, which we call SOTL. And so my scholarship has partly been directed. I'm part of a system that allows part of my scholarship to be directed to critical thinking about teaching and learning and have it count for tenure. And that structural thing, my university's collective agreement, that structural thing makes it possible and centers. UBC is a very large university, but we have multiple hundreds, 350 or so people with my rank across the university to think about this kind of work. And Mona, I know, is waiting for me to say that one of the things that I do, in addition to creating classroom teaching editions, I also am part of, and I'm going to be very bad and share my screen again, the AfriBen online journal, ABO, which is not just about AfriBen, but is about the long 18th century. And I am AfriBen Online's pedagogy editor. I think every discipline should have a journal that has a space to talk about teaching, because teaching is the one thing we all have in common. We all do our other things, but we all teach. And so AfriBen Online, ABO, which is open access, and has no publishing fees and is MLA indexed. Each issue, we have a grouping. This was from 2 issues ago, where we had both a special collection on teaching Margaret Cavendish and a special collection on teaching Anne Finch. And we've tried to formalize an MLA searchable space to do 2 things: to talk about teaching, and every single one of these has a classroom practice located in a critical reflection on this particular author. Now, ABO's mandate is writing related to female creatives and female identified and female associated creatives of the long 18th century. But I want to say there is a place for this kind of scholarship, and it is MLA indexed. And I think looking at most of these titles would count toward your tenure. So it doesn't have to be a special, you don't have to do a special collection, but I'm happy to hear all kinds of publication pitches for a countable publication thinking about teaching in our field. And I hope that will be something that I might hear from some of you as well. But I think that we can, the same as organizing pedagogy sessions in our disciplinary panels, we have the power to do this and to center it. And that's what I wanted to say.
I'll just jump in very quickly to say that now that I've moved into the dean role, I'm not expected to teach. I am teaching this semester because I think it matters for me to get woven into the institution. It matters for my colleagues to know that I know what their lives are like, and I'm still committed to that, but I probably won't be able to do it a lot, and I miss it. And doing the transit series with Mona, reading book manuscripts, reading proposals for grants is something I still get asked to do. And I feel like I've moved from classroom teaching to that because I do think responsibly responding to somebody's work on paper is a form of teaching, of trying to help someone feel heard, of trying to give someone a sense of how someone else encounters their work. And we all know we've had wonderful readers at times who've helped us. And that's the kind of thing that I aspire to. So I'll just put that out there.
So thank you to all speakers, and thank you to Miriam and Kate for pulling this together, and Gina for steering us to a very important question. I I'm going to touch very briefly with each of the panelists and then come back to my dear friend Travis's responsible presentism and Gina's too. I think I'm going to speak from the position of a Global South intellectual, where in my country, it was intellectuals, teachers, professors who practiced public pedagogy in its broadest sense. If you think about Mahatma Gandhi, he went out to the masses, didn't wait for the masses to come to him, and he would be unhappy with the word masses. And really worked and learned with them. And I think we're at a moment in time when we really, really need to do that. We have the power of words. We have the power of a historical understanding. We have a lot of assets that is vital to share. I was in Taipei and I was so impressed. Gina, you will remember this, where the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial has two sides to it. There is the memorial to Chiang Kai-shek, and there is the other side that really challenged, mainly of journalists, writers, editors, and publishers who challenged the repressiveness of part of his regime. And I saw the dialogue happening there, where a society can move forward in really productive ways. So all those who are in the audience, I'm speaking to you, please agree to be reviewers, responsible reviewers. I know it's a task. We ask you to do this for free, but it is an important one as you do the steering and the guidance of what other people are able to read, what scholars can hone down. And I would say that when I have published, Gina, for one, has made my work better. And I learned so much with both Suzanne and Miriam in the Transit series, where we really have the opportunity to invite and curate collections like this. So thank you to all of you for the work that you're doing. And please speak beyond academics. Please think of the Global South as well, that we are at this moment in time experiencing the again of the post of the 18th century and empires.
Thank you, Mona. Does anyone else want to jump in on the question of publishing?
I just want to say that I deeply appreciated this collection, partly because, in a 4-4 job with around 125 to 150 students a semester in composition level courses, usually pedagogy is the impediment to publishing. And, I love my teaching and I love my students, but there's only just so many hours in a given semester. And, it was a joy to be able to bring that expertise into a publishing zone, along with the things I know about the 18th century that I know about the 18th century. And, I would love to be doing different kinds of publishing as well. I'd love to be doing a lot more of the kinds of scholarly publishing that I do when I have any kind of mind space. But there's a certain kind of mind space crowding that happens when your time is and energized simultaneously by work with students that takes up the entire border of the screen. So I appreciate what Tiffany is saying too. I'd like to move beyond that too, but this was a really interesting and unique collection in that it allowed for both the addressing of the pedagogy and also the integration of the scholarship. And I wish we could bring that combination to bear more frequently in our discipline.
Yeah, I agree. Go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly follow on that. I completely agree. And, I think my experience has been that my pedagogy and thinking about my pedagogy has informed how I think about the kind of scholar I want to be. And so I really appreciate, Mona, your words about, the role of intellectuals in public pedagogy, because I think it really is about how does teaching and the responsibility and practice of teaching cause me to question how I want to show up in the other parts of my work. And so I think one of the things that was profound on working on this collection, both working with Miriam and Kate on editing my essay, but also getting to read the other essays as they were kind of in process, was that it became a development space for me to think about those questions about my pedagogy that in turn has informed my scholarship. And I think in particular, as I said, working on this essay in the transition between being on the East Coast and moving to Kansas prompted me to be asking questions about where is the 18th century in Kansas? And that has not only animated how I teach my classes, but it's also, animated my own thinking about what kind of stories I'm looking to tell in my scholarship. So I really think that we all agree we see the profound connections and real meaning of these things. And I think that the value of an edition like this, and Tiffany, what you were talking about with your publication as well, is that I can present this as part of a file for tenure and promotion. And I think a lot of times, where the shoe pinches is when this is not necessarily recognized by stakeholders in my career as scholarship, even though we who are working on it definitely see that and see its value in that way. um and know that the labor is equivalent to other kinds of scholarship. So I think that I really appreciate what editors in the positions that you all are in are doing. And I think that the piece of it that will continue to be helpful is essentially advocating to other academics who are sitting on reviews for tenure and promotion, to recognize this the same way. I think pedagogy, like collaboration, is something where I feel like I have to put a lot of explanations for why this is like real work, equivalent to whatever the picture is of what is satisfactory for those reviews. So I hope that's changing. I think that you know, as a pre-tenure person, this definitely feels more possible than even several years before. And so I think it allows people to build up this as an integral part of their practice from early on, instead of this idea that you kind of have to behave until you get tenure and then you can start doing this stuff. I do think that's shifting. But I think that there's more ways to go to kind of make that possible for more people.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We do have a question from an audience member, and it's Nicole Wright, who, speaking of journals, Nicole is on the editorial board of 18th Century Fiction, and Nicole just agreed to peer review for us. So, you know, it's like you're not supposed to talk about peer review. It's like one of these things you don't want to say too much to protect the process, but I do feel like we've got to celebrate the people who, like Mona said, show up, and Mona's also on the board of ECF. So we love our editorial board. We love all of our reviewers. I feel lucky to be in community with all of you. So Nicole has this great question, which I'll just read out. Given the decline of the perceived value of the cultural capital of knowledge of 18th century literature, so for example, students used to have a passing familiarity with Gulliver's Travels and Robinson Crusoe, at least when they show up in our classrooms, and now we can't, this no longer holds true. We can't assume it. And also, given the reduction of distribution requirements and loss of department staff and resources to help promote courses, what are our panelists' thoughts on making the case to non-majors, particularly STEM majors, to take courses that focus on or somehow involve the 18th century?
I feel like I have very strong feelings about this as someone who regularly likes working with STEM students. As a health humanist, I feel in some ways the most valuable work I can do as a literary and medical historian is have future practitioners and scholars in scientific fields and really engage with the legacy of their own fields, right? Having students learn things about, say, the Nazi T4 Aktion project, or the development of certain kinds of pathologies that are sort of taken for granted as diagnoses now that have 18th century roots, right? It is remarkable to me to see the kinds of aha moments that students have where they realize not just that there is a history that they're not learning, but that their fields themselves perpetuate a kind of progress-oriented triumphalism that humanists are particularly well situated to critique. So I think for me, it's been about framing. Sari Altschuler has a really, really good concluding chapter of her book, The Medical Imagination, which is about humanities competencies and how to sort of really frame this work, especially to folks who are pursuing STEM degrees or in professional programs like nursing. The kinds of really situating what we do in the humanities, the kind of critical thinking work, the attention to language and narrative, as professional acts that you have to do ethical work in your field. I think actually STEM students are very open to that when it is framed to them carefully. And I think the history part is actually not what is they're scared of. It's the expectation to sort of do what we do at our level as humanists, but actually helping empower them to do that work and reminding them that they actually have that capacity to respond to the strangeness that is our history has often been really, really successful. So I think for me, it's about really reminding students that not only do they have a responsibility to the history that they are often not exposed to, but also that that exposure will make them better practitioners. And as much as it does sound a little bit utilitarian, it has often been the strategy that has been most compelling for those students.
I think Travis is absolutely on track there. I mean, a lot of it involves naming and framing, right? Helping students to understand through the name of the course and the description in the catalog how it is that this already connects to what they find worthwhile. It's not STEM students at my institution right now, it's criminal justice students, but I'm working on an Old Bailey to today history of law enforcement and rule of law through literature that is already getting people pulling in from the criminal justice folks to find out how they can recommend this to their students, because it's the kind of thing their students need to know. And they didn't know it was what their students needed to know until I framed it that way. And then all of a sudden, the course that I was already teaching suddenly seemed very pertinent to them. So, that kind of restructuring the language with which we address our students about what we're doing, I think, is really the crucial connection.
Yeah, Emily.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really interesting question. I would say as a art historian, most students don't have access to art history in high school. I have never been able to presume any kind of body of knowledge about what I teach prior to them coming to the classroom. And I'm recalling the last time I taught Art of the United States, when I asked them to name like top of mind iconic work of art about the foundation of the country. Unanimously, it was Washington crossing the Delaware, which is a 19th century painting. It's kind of about the 18th century. It has Washington in it, but it's not from the period itself. So in some ways, I actually find that really liberating, and I wonder. I think there are some important similarities, but also marked differences between teaching literature and art history. And so I wonder if there is something kind of that's liberatory about that within teaching um, literature as well, and just not presuming that students know anything. And so I have a kind of clear ground for introducing and framing it in the way that I think is valuable. Um, and then the second part of it, also coming from an art historical perspective about STEM students in particular, is that one of the ways that I try and frame the value of what I do to students in STEM fields is that we're both connected by a need to practice close looking. That in biology classes, they are doing what we call visual analysis. They're having to work on description in writing, also often through drawing. And so that practicing those skills and learning to slow down the eye and the mind to be making critical connections through that kind of visual analysis is something that is a crossover skill. And I guess you can relate this to visual literacy. I think it's kind of even broader than that. So I think that's really the selling point. And then I think, kind of following on Travis's point, I teach a weird class on art and the sea that has a lot of early modern material in it, and I get a lot of environmental studies students in those classes, and they're not necessarily practicing hard sciences, but they are coming from like a more scientific perspective. And I think opening up a kind of humanities dimension to this thing that they really care about, which is the relationship between the human and more than human world, our role as stewards, destructors, inhabitants of environmental spaces. Um, I think having cross conversations where I can really center them as knowledge experts in what they're bringing to the topic is another way that I learn from them, but I think also makes the class feel meaningful for them.
Tiffany?
I don't,
No, I'm going to say, what I had to say is not important enough to supersede the thing I'm dying to hear you say, Gina. I want to
Okay.
hear.
I will. I'm going to dangle it as a carrot, but I do want to say, I know that we're now at 4:03. We have one more quick question from an audience member. Are our panelists okay to stick around for another couple of minutes? So Naomi Caligaro has written, I'm researching Mariah Edgeworth, who during part of her childhood lived a stone's throw from my home here in Hertfordshire, England, which I'm sure is very beautiful and lovely and not covered in snow, probably like Hamilton, Ontario, where I am. Naomi is interested in whether any of our panelists have thoughts about the relevance of Mariah Edgeworth, her educational work and her literary work to students now in the 21st century. it's been years since I taught Mariah Edgeworth, but I get very excited whenever I get like submissions to ECF. So I'll say like, because I don't know that anyone here has had the time to delve into Edgeworth specifically, but also, one of the beautiful things about the relationship between pedagogy and researching 18th century literary works in particular, not exclusively, is that there are these really interesting kind of organic cohorts of writers who do, like Edgeworth, who really do take on a kind of active pedagogical role or see themselves as pedagogues in some way. So maybe if not Edgeworth, are there any figures that, come up in your own work or that work really well in the classroom that you kind of look to as examples of not just material to teach from the 18th century, but like fellow teachers from the 18th century?
I spend a lot of time unteaching Samuel Richardson.
Yeah, I think along the same vein as Tiffany, what comes to my mind is the work I do teaching about early museum and institutional collecting and its role in the formation of ideas about like American citizenship, cultural identity, like who is a citizen of the United States, and in particular the work of Charles Wilson Peale and his museum in Philadelphia, which was in Constitution Hall, like making super clear this relationship between a kind of cultural project and a national political project. And so I do think about sort of 18th century pedagogies broadly in my context. And in that case, sort of like what Tiffany's saying, thinking critically about them. But I do think that's useful to pedagogy more broadly, that it is part of a project of making visible to students how my pedagogy is informing what they are learning, and like how we're framing things, is to see examples of that in history.
Thank you all so much. So quickly, I will say, take this if it helps you out. Astrologically, there are some big things happening in the sky right in our now that last happened in the 18th century. One of the most notable ones, if you listen to any astrological podcasts, you're already on top of this because they've been talking about it since last year. But Pluto just recently changed signs from Capricorn into Aquarius. It takes Pluto roughly 250 years to make a full orbit through the zodiac, which means the last time that Pluto was in the sign of Aquarius was the age of the American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution. So the kinds of narratives that are being told astrologically right now, by the stars as interpreted by astrologers, are literally like linking the world we are in right now on Earth to the world that the people of the 18th century were in on Earth. And when I tell this to students, they're like, where do I sign up for 18th century courses? Like, what is that? When, where, who? Lure them in with the astrology and use tarot to lure them into narrative theory.
Thank you, Gina. And on that note, we've gone almost 10 minutes over. I really didn't want to stop this very rich discussion, but maybe it's fodder for a future A6 panel. I think we could go on for quite a bit longer here. But thank you again to Gina and to Miriam and to Kate Parker, who couldn't be here today, for conceiving of this volume and bringing it to us, and to Terry and Travis and Emily and Tiffany for participating today, and for all the attendees who made time to listen to this panel. Again, it has been recorded. I dropped some information in the chat about the Transits book series and about the book itself, if you haven't gotten a copy yet. There's a link to the book's webpage and a discount code that you can use if you would like to. My thanks again, and I wish you all a wonderful day. Thank you.